It's April 7th, 2017. My name is Nick Salvatore, the School of Industrial Labor Relations here at Cornell, and I'm proud to introduce to you Fran Blau, Professor Fran Blau, who is the Francis Perkins Professor of Industrial and Labor Relations and Professor of Economics at Cornell. And Fran, maybe a way to begin would be to ask the following of you. In an essay you wrote some years ago entitled On Becoming and Being an Economist, you wrote of yourself in the late 1950s and early 1960s, quote, "I was always very career-orientated, even though at the time most social pressures were for women to think in terms of managing their family." How did that motivation take root in you, and then how did it develop in those early years especially?
It's a really good question. I wish I fully knew the answer to it. It's partly, I'm speculating a little, but I look back at my family situation, and my mother had health problems, and my father was the major person in my life. Indeed, my brother and I lived with our father from my being 10 years old on. So I was actually from a male household, and then my father himself, for some reason, somebody had not slipped him the message of how he was supposed to socialize me, but he was always very supportive of every career idea I had. And I don't know, Nick, you might remember the TV show Perry Mason.
Oh, sure.
Where he was a lawyer and he solved all these crimes, and I thought he was so great. I decided at a young age I wanted to be a lawyer too. And I made comments, and my father said, "That's your legal mind. You have a great legal mind." So whatever I came up with, if it was, quote, appropriate or not appropriate for a girl, he seemed supportive of it. I think that was the start. And maybe another element was I was just enormously academically oriented. I loved school. I did very well in school. And that somehow it seemed that following up on that and those interests was going to involve a career. But I do want to tell you that I feared I was in those days, going to pay a big price for that. And my college roommate and I got together for our 25th anniversary, and she reminded me that I thought I was going to be Auntie Fran to her kids, and that I wouldn't have a family of my own because I didn't think maybe a guy would be interested in a woman with these, but that wasn't true, fortunately.
That wasn't true, right. So how you come to Cornell, to the ILR school in the fall of 1963, how did Cornell help you develop a further confidence and maybe even specificity about what this professional career, what it would be for you?
Yes, Cornell was absolutely instrumental in my development, and it started in part with the way I felt about the professors. I had so many really excellent teachers that I looked up to. And I'd just like to mention some of them. There was Robert Ferguson, who became my mentor, and that was extremely important. But others who just either set a high bar that I admired or encouraged me: George Hildebrand, Gardner Clark, Gerd Corman, who I know you know. He opened up a world of social history, and in the art school, Walter Lefebvre. So they were, first of all, just exciting me about my studies. And then it's amazing how important little things can be. I still remember I was in an honors class in the second semester of introductory economics. George Hildebrand was teaching it, and he wrote on my exam, "Excellent exam, you should major in economics." And I said, wow, I guess I'm good at economics. You know what I mean? I hadn't thought about it before that. And then I started kind of, well, you know, this is something I'm good at. You know, maybe I could develop this further. And again, I got very close to Bob Ferguson at this time, and he was just so enormously encouraging about going on in this area and made me feel really special and unusual. And Nick, at that time, women were getting 7% of the PhDs in economics.
Right. Yeah.
So what it meant for these professors to encourage me like that, it just really meant everything.
Well, that actually brings up the next related question about what was your experience at Harvard? Because you talk about, in one of your writings, you talk about when you went to Harvard for a PhD in economics, your entering class was something like 63 men and 4 women. So how did, and you come out of Cornell and out of ILR with this kind of robust sense of the possible. How did Harvard work out?
Well, in the long run, it worked out very well. In the short run, it was very, very difficult. So let me back up here a little bit. I think something I should say about Cornell and ILR when I entered in 1963, women were about 40% of the students at Cornell. And it wasn't just that question on the application side. There was a quota on women at the ILR school. There was a maximum number, not a quota, you have to take at least so many. It was you could take no more than.
Yeah.
And there was a limit of 15 women in my class, entering class at ILR, out of some 80 to 100 students. So we went back. I mentioned my family situation. Now I'm telling you actually that ILR was a predominantly male environment. So in one sense, I should have been ready for Harvard. But it was such an extreme minority. I would be in a classroom situation and I might not physically see another woman around. I was aware of no women on the faculty. I had just turned 20 years old in August before I started. And aside, the encouragement I got at ILR was incredible, but none of us really thought too hard about the courses I needed. And that was partly the times. I mean, today it's just enormously important in economics that you have to have exact, but at the time there was more flexibility. I had taken introductory economics and a couple of applied classes. I had not taken intermediate theory, which is very important because one step builds on another. I always loved math. I was good at it. I took calculus, but there were a number of further advanced math courses I hadn't had. So I guess one thing I would say that I do think is an important point to make, when you're a minority, it's just very easy to question yourself. And you're in a situation, perhaps, that's hard for anybody. I mean, it's just hard for anybody. But then you have this additional layer. And when things get challenging, instead of saying, well, you know, it's tough, it'll work out, you say, just maybe this isn't the right place for me. Maybe I just don't have it. So that wasn't Harvard's fault, but it was an adjustment for me. One more point I would make is that I was so young, and I found a lot of my classmates had graduated at a more normal age and then had done some things first, and they were more, they knew why they were there, more focused and determined.
So,
Yeah.
okay.
I'm ready.
Okay. So what about at Harvard? You talked about certain professors at Cornell, for example, who were very influential. Did you have a similar experience at Harvard?
To some extent. I mean, I think that I did feel like a little bit of an orphan at Harvard because of something that I have even written about, that in a male field, the professors tend to identify with the young men. They look at them and say, oh, you know, that reminds me of how I was when I was young. And they just don't quite feel the same way with a young woman. This just reminded me of one professor who defended me once, but in an odd way. One of my classmates at a party we were having for grad students said, what are you doing here? What good is a PhD in economics going to do you when you just get married and have kids? And so one of the professors was there, and he leapt to my surprise, to my defense, and he said, you'd be surprised. So great, I mean, it'll help me, decide whether to get, disposable or washable diapers. That's not why I was there, But he was trying, he was trying. But eventually, I did cross paths with one professor who was an enormous help and inspiration to me, at a very, very critical time, and also has been an enormous impact on the whole profession, and that is Richard Freeman of Harvard, who's just incredible. And for various reasons, I had, by then, after 3 years at Harvard, I left residence, and I was living elsewhere and still working on my dissertation. That's a very hard situation for anyone. And Richard had just actually come to Harvard as an assistant professor, but I needed another person on my committee, and someone said, oh, why don't you speak to Richard? And I must have spoken to him for an hour or half an hour, and it was just, everything fell into place. He was fabulous. So he deserves a real shout out there.
Okay. Let me go back to Cornell just for one moment. I guess it would have been roughly your junior year in 1964. School would have been out by then, by June of '64, but there was a horrific triple murder in Mississippi of civil rights workers. And I raise it because it was of enormous importance throughout the country, but also because you have a distinct social concern in your work. And I'm wondering whether there was any, whether that touched you, whether that event touched you in any way.
I feel almost like I'm tearing up now. It just touched me massively. Of course, there were so many things that happened around that time and later that were very touching about the civil rights movement. But this event where the 3 civil rights workers were murdered in Mississippi, they were my peers in a sense. They were around my age. They had simply gone there to register voters. And there was actually a Cornell connection. One of them was a Cornell graduate before I got to Cornell. Another, and another, Andrew Goodman, went to Queens College, but his brother went to Cornell, and I knew his brother. This had actually happened to the brother of somebody I knew. I also have, in the same vein, very strong memories as a child of seeing in the news these brave African-American children integrating schools, walking through crowds of hostile whites to do it. So I so admired their bravery. But interestingly, Nick, I think that brings up another point, and that is that when I started Cornell in 1963, it was almost like the 50s. The mentality. We talk about the 60s, but the 60s are really the mid to late 60s. They are not the early 60s. But during my time at Cornell, all kinds of things were happening. I graduated early in '66. The war in Vietnam was evolving, and there were some protest and dissent about that. In fact, I learned fascinating things about it in some of my classes about the issues. The civil rights movement was becoming very important, and we would eventually, in '64, we would pass the Civil Rights Act. But there was almost no talk of feminism. Almost no talk. And I myself didn't think about it, even though I was socially active, as you say. We often date the modern feminist movement to 1963 when Betty Friedan wrote The Feminist Mystique. I have to confess that I didn't read it till a few years later. It was a great book. It was a great book. And one of the lines from it I always remember, the problem that has no name. The women were kind of realizing things just weren't quite right, but it didn't have a name. I told you about the quota on women. Well, there was a quota on women. well, there weren't very many female faculty. Well, I never met a fellow female classmate who was an engineer major, although I did know one who was an architecture major, one. So we saw it, but we didn't process it somehow. So that was something that happened after I left Cornell. To me personally, I think to a lot of people.
Right. Can you switch to some of your work? Your first, what would become your first book, which was your dissertation on the gender pay gap. Can you talk about it? What were you grappling with then in that first really major project? You'd done papers before and perhaps even a senior honors thesis, but this dissertation was really the first and became your first book.
Well, that's, I think that I'd like to talk a little bit about the role of studying gender in my life, and maybe this is kind of picking up about how I felt, before getting to the specifics here, how I felt at Harvard and kind of out of place and insecure, and honestly, probably half my classmates felt that way, but we didn't talk about it. In any case, as the dissertation loomed, saying, what do I have to say? What do I have to research that somebody else hasn't already? I mean, do I have any ideas or whatever? Around that time, I became more aware of and knowledgeable about feminism and the status of women. And that helped me in a number of ways. First of all, it kind of got me outside my head. You know, my head is, am I going to fail? Am I going to succeed as an individual? And this was, boy, I could work on something that would be important to a lot of people, and I could contribute in that sense. The other thing is that suddenly I had a million ideas and thoughts, and you know, it excited me. And I guess in the essay you mentioned earlier, I mean, I talk about the importance of working on something that really excites you. And this was it. It was also not completely, but partly virgin territory in economics. Economics was an overwhelmingly male field. It was heavily oriented towards market activities, and women, there wasn't really all that much written about women at the time. So I read widely, including in sociology, which had been paying attention to this much longer. And I felt that I got kind of a big insight through the readings in sociology that emphasize the importance of segregation, of women being in different activities or locations than men. And also my own inner feeling about what was okay and wasn't okay. So let me back up and say there had been one extensive and thoughtful in many respects analysis of the gender pay gap. And what that author had done was kind of take every variable you could think of that might explain it and use it to discount the gap. So some of it might be due to occupations, so we'll net out that. That's perfectly okay. Some of it might be due to this and that. And then firms, women and men work in different firms, so we don't want to look at that except to say that we want to look at the gap within the same firm. And I said, man, that's segregation. We want to talk about what role segregation has in causing a gender pay gap. Now, one thing you want to do whenever you look at wage differentials is control for differences in productivity. So if you're a guy and you earn more than me, but you earn 50% more than me, but you're 50% more productive, it's not necessarily a social problem, or at least it's not a labor market problem. It might be a problem with how we were brought up. We might want to look at that. So I realized that there were situations, and there was a possible source of data on men and women who were in the same very, very narrowly defined occupation, so presumably equally productive, but it gave information on what firm they worked on. So I made that actually the focus of my dissertation, the role of the segregation of men and women by firm in explaining the overall labor market wage gap. And I built a theoretical model in which some firms had some advantage in the market, so they didn't have to compete as hard with other firms. Maybe they were had some monopoly power. And they could kind of spend that extra money on hiring their preferred group of workers. So I said that most employers had prejudices against women, but some employers could act on it more, and those were the high-paying firms. So what I found in my work is that women were disproportionately located in low-wage firms that paid low wages to both men and women when they were employed there. And men were disproportionately in the high-wage firms that paid high wages. But one of the most interesting things was enormous segregation. Within firms, you could have 100% male workforce or 100% female workforce in an occupation that had both men and women in it.
Right. Wow. So that you were really the first to begin to explore that in
the firm level.
At the firm level, right? Exactly. That okay. Let me ask, going from that, let me ask the question about your second book, which you did with your husband Larry Kahn. So I want to ask about that in a minute, but first about you and Larry working together. But first, the book, the gender pay gap. Draw you out just a little bit more on that. What was that about?
Nick, as you know, that was joint work with my husband, fellow labor economist, and today Cornell labor economist as well, Larry Kahn. And we were invited to participate in a research project by the National Bureau of Economic Research that brought together labor economists to examine a number of issues in an international context. So this was in the early 90s. And this was a time when we were, American labor economists, were increasingly realizing that wage inequality was starting to rise. And interesting that we're talking about it now, because it's kind of come home to roost in terms of our current situation. But people were realizing that inequality was increasing, and so Richard Freeman actually had working with Larry Katz, had the insight of getting a team of economists to look at different issues and questions related to inequality. So Larry Katz and Richard Freeman had the insight of looking at a number of questions related to inequality in an international context. Because interestingly, especially at that time, wage inequality had not increased as much in other countries as in the United States. And they kind of said, well, you know, it would be interesting to have something about the gender wage gap, too. So Larry and I started looking into it. And we uncovered kind of a paradox. So I have to step back to tell you a little bit what the paradox was. When labor economists looked, especially at that time, at differences in wages between two groups, the two things they generally emphasized was, first of all, differences in productivity that I mentioned before, qualifications. And second was the possibility of discrimination. Well, when Larry and I looked at how countries ranked in terms of the gender wage gap, we found to our surprise that the U.S. had one of the largest gender wage gaps among all the advanced industrialized countries. Why would that be? I mean,
this is in about the mid-70s, late
well,
or
no,
later?
this is in the early 90s using data from the 1980s.
From the 80s, okay.
Yeah, and earlier I think would have been true as well. Yeah, thanks for,
Yeah.
So why is that puzzling? Well, we knew in terms of data that U.S. women were relatively well qualified compared to their male counterparts relative to women in other countries. So they weren't less skilled relative to men than women in other countries. the U.S. was actually a leader in passing anti-discrimination legislation. We mentioned that was 1964.
Right.
Many of the other countries were considerably later. So this was a paradox. And we, stimulated in part from the overall nature of the projects, that maybe it's somehow related to wage inequality. But how? So we drew on work, excellent work by Shinhee Jun, Brooks Pierce, and Kevin Murphy, who had examined somewhat related issues, examining trends in the race wage gap in the United States over time. But the point they made that was so relevant here is overall rewards to labor market skills can impact groups differently. So what distinguished these other countries from the US was a much larger role for unions and government in establishing wages. And what those interventions did was to compress the wage structure, particularly bringing up the bottom of the wage structure. Now, in all countries, women are disproportionately at the bottom, so women disproportionately benefit from policies like that. So the big insight here was an apparently neutral thing, just how low-wage workers fare in general, and how it impacts a particular group, and that is women. And what we found, for example, was Sweden had one of the smallest wage gaps in the world. But if they had our returns to skills and our more dispersed wage structure, they would have had the same gender gap that we did.
So I have to ask you, because it's not done every day, but so what's it like working with your spouse? I mean, you squabble over a footnote. Does it carry over into dinner?
Well, okay, there's so much to say about that. Let me explore the history of that a little bit. So when we were assistant professors, and we actually, my husband likes to say, we had good planning, and we met as assistant professors at our first job. So we did not have a two-career problem initially, at least. And we both did actually get tenure. This was at the University of Illinois. And we had actually had our first child, and I mean, I don't want to sound like we're incredible nerds, but we got involved in a joint project as well as the child in a joint research project. And it was actually very efficient. You know, we could be up at 2 in the morning because our child was crying, and we could say, hey, you know, if we ran that regression. So we kind of had a great time. But we were assistant professors, or I think we're assistant or recently promoted, and we had the idea that we did not want to get too closely identified with each other at an early stage in the career, because then it would get to be an issue of people getting full credit or not getting full credit. You know, how do you allocate it? So we wrote a few papers together that we really enjoyed, but we continued, you know, doing other projects alone or with other people. And then we came back to it when we were both more professionally established. And I have to say that, and I know all my other co-authors will forgive me, that Larry is the best co-author I've ever had. I mean, we have very complementary skills. And I've always felt about co-authorship in general, and this in particular, it's not about being more productive, it's about doing better quality work. Because you have a kind of a critic and a discussant right there. And I have to say, in your footnote point, Larry's disposition has been really helpful, because I may get really worked up about something and gesturing and this and that, and he'll say, okay, so we could do this, you know, and he doesn't get easily bent out of shape. The only really bad part is if you're behind in what you're doing, then you have to face that person.
Earlier you said, and I just want to go back to it, draw you out more, you talked about doing things because you're passionate about them. Probably it's fair to say that the image of economics and economists, at least to non-economists, is one of less enthusiasm and more let's get this part done, let's get that part done, we got to bring this piece in. What do you mean by that, about don't do work unless you're enthusiastic? Where does that play with this whole academic discussion about objectivity?
Oh, that's a very good question. And it is actually a question that somewhat dogged me in my early career. So when I got interested in gender, as I mentioned, the plus was there wasn't a lot of existing research on it. The minus was there was not a lot of existing research on it. And people had mixed feelings. Was that a serious thing to be working on?
Right.
Could a woman be objective about that?
Right.
So I think that it kind of raised people's hackles a little. And I thought that was misplaced. And I want to be really clear here. I am concerned about advocacy, if you want to call it that, masquerading as research. Advocacy on the right or the left. I mean, not that people have those views, but if they bring them too much into the research where they would distort the research, I think that's a problem. But feeling passionately about something doesn't necessarily lead to distortion. It leads to, it's enormously energizing, and you want to find out the answer. And so it motivates you through a lot of the hard work and dry spells and worries that we all have, you know, as we move along. So, and moreover, I think it can give you insights. Like I mentioned before, I was more attuned to inequities than some of my more conservative male colleagues, that they might just miss something due to that. So as long as you are completely committed to following and establishing the truth, I think that it's okay. I would say that when I was quite young, I wrote, "If the cause is just, the truth can't hurt it." I'm not 100% sure in our current environment. I had a bad experience recently, if we could
Sure.
go on a tangent.
Please.
Not a bad, this is not, the bad experience is going to come, but I had a very positive experience. And I was asked by one area I have worked in addition to gender is immigration.
Right.
And I was asked by the National Academy of Sciences to chair a panel on the economic and fiscal impact of immigration. And this was a very, very serious undertaking. It involved experts from the fields of economics, demography, and sociology. We worked for 2.5 years to produce a report. Some Academy reports just simply pull the literature together, which can be enormously useful. We did that plus independent research on fiscal impacts, that's budgetary impacts. And we wrote as far as we possibly could, and I think we did, comprehensive and objective analysis, 400-page report. And it was released in September of 2016. And people, especially the right wing, cherry-picked it. They take a number out of context and use it to support the idea that immigration was negative.
Yeah.
Overall, I think it's safe to say the baseline conclusion of the report was that immigration was quite positive in many respects, promoting growth and innovation. There was no evidence of any negative effects on wages and employment of natives overall. However, if there were any impacts that were negative, and here the evidence was mixed, they appeared to be on the least skilled natives, the high school dropouts. No evidence, by the way, of any negative effects on a high school graduate group, which has been the center of the angst supporting Donald Trump's candidacy and election. The fiscal picture was a bit more mixed and nuanced, and we discussed it, but here again, in the long run, the effects appear to be at least neutral. And states we identified had particular burdens for educating the children of immigrants. So if you're in a high immigration state, that could have an impact on your budget. But actually, we found the second generation, that is, native-born individuals with immigrant parents, are the best fiscal contributors once they become adults. In any case, this was a complex and nuanced thing, and Breitbart cherry-picked it.
Yeah, right.
And so I still am committed to, I have to be, to truth. But I'm sorry that in our, and let me say, we got enormous coverage by the mainstream press that was quite balanced and consistent with what we had done. But the Breitbart, and I think it's the Washington Times and some of that ilk.
So in a sense, but when you talk about passion, you're talking about following a insight, a sensibility, a desire to learn more about something, but doing the hard work to learn more about it, so that, and not shying away from material that might complicate what maybe personally you or others might particularly want.
Exactly. And I had an experience with that kind of early in my career. It would have been, I think, the 1980s. I did one of the early studies on the impact of mothers working on their children's cognitive ability, and it was using a data set that had the information available, or let's say the outcomes, intellectual outcomes of their children. And overall, in fact, I found that if mothers worked and presumably put their kids in some alternative care, when the kids were 2 or 3, those kids actually did a bit better than kids who stayed home with their moms, maybe because of the stimulation of a child care setting or nursery school. But I did find some negative effects for mothers working in the first year of their children's lives. Now, one way to look at that was, I emphasized that we did not control for the quality of alternative care, and that also, since mothers working a bit later had a positive effect, if they worked all the way through, the positive effect could outweigh the negative. Well, I personally worked during the first year of my children's lives. And this was incredible. This was picked up by the press, and the headlines in different outlets would be totally different. Problems with moms working. Good news for working moms. I mean, it was, you know. And I even had, they say, and I'm not saying, but stereotype is women aren't good at math. I even had somebody call me personally to discuss whether she should work. And I guess I said, I can't say whether you should work, but here's my finding. She said, yes, but if I stayed home in the first year, my kids would be doing even that much better. She saw right away, you know. And I said, come on, I mean, I can't invite, no, I'm joking, but I'm an economist. But I do, you know, but in any case, around that time I was talking to somebody and they said, you never should have looked at it if it had any possibility of coming out the way you did. No. I said, no, I don't think that could be, you know.
So you have had already an illustrious career. And there are a couple of major, one international prize that I know of, the IZA prize. Could you talk a little bit about what that is and what it means? Because I know it's not something that every economist wins.
Thank you. Well, thanks for mentioning that, Nick. Well, the IZA is an international organization of labor economists based in Bonn, Germany. And they established an award. It was sort of like a lifetime achievement award in labor economics for having a particularly important impact on an area of labor economics. And I have to say I was just incredibly honored. In 2010 they awarded it to me for my work in gender and inequality. And you know, it's a cliche. You watch the Academy Awards and they always say, by your peers. But that's how I felt, by my peers, people who actually know my work. And I was the first woman to win that.
Wonderful.
And I was really pleased, in addition to personally, that I felt it was also legitimation of the work on gender, which I think has been legitimated for many years now, but it was legitimated through the very hard work, not just of me, but of many, 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 many scholars, clearly doing objective, careful, thorough research, males and females, that made economists understand this was serious work.
Now, later this month, you're going to receive an award from the ILR School, the Growth Award. Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I have to say, somebody asked me recently, did you ever think that you might come back to ILR as a professor someday? And I have to say that the first thing that came to my mind was, no, I mean, those professors, when I was here, they were giants. They strode the earth like a colossus. Me? You know? Of course, by the time I did come back in '94, I did feel up to the job. But so first of all, that's just an enormous honor to me, to be an ILR school professor or a Cornell professor. But the Growth Award is for contributions to the field of industrial and labor relations. So I am really flattered that I think it takes in my contributions to research in that area and to Cornell. So it does value my contribution to Cornell, and so it is a great honor.
Well, that's good. I noted too, where I was stunned by it actually, that your book, The Economics of Women, Men, and Work, is coming out in its 8th edition in 2018. How has it progressed? How have you changed it over time? That's fantastic, to be frank.
Well, going back, the first edition was in 1986. And so when it came out, I had a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old, but my kids were even younger when I first started working on it, because we all know that you're working on things for a long time before they come out. So it was kind of a big decision. I think it's worth talking about, because you know, I'm a very risk-averse person, but when we get into a conversation like this, I kind of realize that I've done a number of risky things in my life. And one was to study gender in the first place. The other, as a relatively new tenured associate professor, to write a textbook. Because economists, well, scholars in general don't necessarily value textbooks, even though I think they're very important. So how and why did I do it? Well, it started with a colleague, Marianne Ferber, who was a wonderful inspiration to me. She just died a couple of years ago at age 90. But we could do a whole thing on Mary Ann's life. Let me just say that as a teenager, Mary Ann left with her family from Czechoslovakia the day after the Munich Pact was signed.
Wow.
Yes. And they had, she was Jewish, obviously, that was important. And the Munich Pact was, Hitler was marching into Czechoslovakia. Her very entrepreneurial father had gotten them passage to Canada because he was in a strategic occupation, which was farming, which is crazy on so many levels. I mean, first of all, Jewish people are very seldom farmers because they, many countries were not allowed to own land and farm it, but also that was considered a strategic occupation. Anyway, it goes on from there. So she's quite a character and an inspiration. So we were both teaching a course on gender, but we were bumbling along with that textbook because there wasn't a textbook. And we said, wow, what if we write one? And we were kind of inventing everything. What would be the structure of this textbook? Well, we felt very strongly it should include the family as well as the labor market. You know, what topics covered and how. So it was a very innovative, and I think I have gotten credit for that. So it's not just when you're established, you know, it's great to write a good textbook, but when it's all there for you and you're just seeking to explain it. But we had to innovate. Now, it has really helped my research career, to get back to your question, how have things changed? Because we have a substantial empirical component to it. We have the latest data, so every 4 years or so we update it. We put the latest data in it. I see all these trends, and then I want to understand them.
That's great.
But let me just say, when we started this textbook, on average in the labor market, men were more likely to be college graduates than women. Right. Now women are more likely to be college graduates than men. So major trends like that will come along, and we grapple with them.
Right. So, because I mean, the 8th edition is there are very relatively few books that reach that number, and that's just.
Let me say also, in the 3rd edition, we were joined by my former student Ann Winkler, who's I'm really very fond of her, and she's at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and she has been hard at work with us on this, and now the 8th edition will be just Ann and me, because Mary Ann is gone.
So, what's coming up in the future for you? What projects, where do you see your work taking you, and what kind of issues do you want to engage?
Well, I think that I always maintain an interest in gender, and sometimes I take it in different directions. But interestingly, with Larry, I have a new paper coming out, will be published in the fall, on the gender wage gap, where we do 2 things there. We have an original new empirical analysis that brings everything, looks at a 30-year period, 1980 to 2010, and what the factors, what's happened to the gap, and what factors have helped to cause it. But then we combine that with an extensive review of the literature and what we've learned. So that'll always be on my time horizon. One interesting thing we found there was that there has been enormous progress, and it's very important to say that, in reducing the gap. There is still a gap, so there's still a problem. But one thing we found is actually the pay gap has closed less at the higher ends of skill distribution than at the lower end. So I suspect going in the future that's something that I'm going to want to look into a bit more. The other big area now is immigration, because I had done research on immigration, but I just see it as so important to the national discourse. And I was very distressed during our recent presidential election where one of the candidates, now President Trump, was essentially scapegoating immigrants for problems that are caused by larger economic forces, particularly technological change. One issue that has interested me a lot is how, doesn't answer that problem, but I have worked actually with Larry too in the past, and we have some future projects in mind, how the culture in the source country influences the behavior of immigrants in the U.S. And we found fascinating balances between assimilation, which definitely occurs and is very important, but the long hand of the culture of the place where you were brought up.
Yeah.
And can I just mention,
Please.
Nick, that one personal tie I feel to this is that 3 of my grandparents were born abroad, and the 4th one, who I consider like she came with the Pilgrims or whatever, her father was, her parents were born abroad. So my forebears came in the great wave of immigration, the previous great wave of immigration in the 1890s through the early 1900s. And they, maybe not personally, but they too were looked askance at and blamed for many social problems. They said those people would never assimilate. And I think that, in fact, both my parents graduated from college, and I think I'm some evidence of assimilation. So the people coming now will make excellent contributions too. We've always had periods, you might be, I'm sure as a historian, aware of the Know-Nothing movement in the 1800s that attacked Irish immigrants. So I think it's socially very important.
Yeah. A question, maybe an overview. You talked eloquently before about your experience at Cornell in the 1960s, multiple dimensions of it. Now you've been here for 20-something years, almost more than, yeah. As a faculty member, having both men and women students in class, having both men and women students in one-on-one on office hours, etc. How do you see if there, well, how would you compare your experience with what, as best you can gauge, what the experience of young women here at Cornell now is? Again, your view of it rather than some overall sociological analysis.
Well, that's a fascinating question. I think it's improved greatly. I think it's improved greatly. I mean, first of all, the women are not a minority anymore, which I think is very helpful. So many issues that we didn't even know the name of are now at the fore: sexual harassment, et cetera, and there are places to go for help for things that we had no idea. But one danger, I think, is that maybe, I think it's turning around a little, but we go through periods where young women feel, feminism, concern about women's issues, it's a thing of the past. And it's not. I wish it was. I mean, I'm not holding on to it because, I want it to be so. Because one thing I learned through my own personal experience, and that period of time when I was not aware, but then I became aware and what things happened to me. In the period of time when I was not aware, if anything went awry for me that in hindsight seemed to be related to sexism, I blame myself. I had an incredible experience if we have the time, but when I had been at Harvard for 2 years, then I was 22, I was given a TA assignment. It was the first time I was a TA for introductory economics. And at Harvard, that was a very big responsibility because introductory was taught in a large lecture class and accompanied by sections that met, as I recall, maybe 2 or 3 times a week. I can't remember. And you were their main instructor, really, in addition to the big lectures. But to not just talk about the lectures, but teach the material. And so I was terribly nervous. And I was standing at the blackboard, and I was kind of writing a list of things that I wanted to cover on the blackboard. In those days, people wrote on the blackboard. Some people still do.
I do.
Yeah, I suspected as much. So there was a voice in the class, and a guy. Oh, by the way, it was an overwhelmingly male class because it was at Harvard, and there were students at Radcliffe, women who could have been in the class, but even in those days, even introductory was a male field. So this guy said, "Who's she?" very loudly. "What's she doing up there? What does she know about economics?" And I stood there, patient by myself. Who am I? What am I doing up here? What do I know about economics? And then I just did not know what to do. And then the door opened, and a student poked his head in and said, "Ec 10?" And my heckler said, "No, sex education." And I knew I had to do something. I thought before I could ignore it. And I turned around without thinking, and I looked straight at him, and I said, "Did somebody say something?" And I didn't know what he would do. I thought he might engage. It was like he was punctured, a balloon.
Yeah.
I didn't, did you hear it? I didn't hear it. And he never gave me any trouble again. But it was, that's what I mean about gender issues. It's a situation that's hard and difficult for anybody, and then you face this additional hurdle. But the funny thing is, I can hardly say it with a straight face, I thought the problem was maybe that I had worn a dress with ruffles on it. Maybe I brought it on myself.
The last tendril of blaming oneself. Yeah.
So I do think it's important that women have a certain level of consciousness so they don't blame themselves for things that go wrong. Yeah. Although I think it's also important, honestly, after all these years, I can say, to let some things roll off your back. People are not perfect. They don't always say things exactly right. So I wouldn't get upset about everything, but again, so you don't blame yourself.
Yeah. Maybe just a final question. How would you, you could have gone almost anywhere, and you and Larry both could have gone almost anywhere. What was it that kept you here, and what was it about Cornell, that both ILR and the university, that you've obviously thrived here, but you've also given so much to this whole institution. But it's wonderful you're here. I don't.
You wouldn't be anywhere else,
No,
honestly. Yeah. But well, I mean, my roots do go a long way here. The undergraduate roots do. But honestly, Nick, I think you've noticed, it's a place that people love. I have gotten very involved in alumni activities because, I can go to reunions easily because I'm here. Actually, I have 2 classes because I graduated a year early, so I kind of go to 2 reunions sometimes. The alums love Cornell. I mean, they look back at it as such an important part of their lives. The students are incredible, thoughtful, and provocative in a good way. The faculty, I mean, Larry and I, as I said, we met in our first job. That was the University of Illinois. We had a tremendous experience there. We both built the early stages of our research careers there and thrived. We had wonderful colleagues. But it wasn't a place that bound you so much emotionally, in a sense. this is an exaggeration, but I sometimes felt at Illinois, if someone got a better job offer, they're gone. I've seen many people turn down better job offers at Cornell. You know, the way people feel about Cornell.
Great. Anything else that you want to, that I might not have raised?
Well, you know, one thing I thought might be helpful would be to talk about work-family issues just a little bit.
Okay,
yeah,
sure.
Yeah.
Sure, the managing of that. Yeah,
yes,
please.
and so I do think it's important. First of all, everybody has to make their own decision. Not everybody's interested in marriage or children with or without marriage, whatever. And that's their own decision. But I don't want women to feel that they have to choose between a career and family. And I do think it's important to tell women that I, for example, was able to do both. I have two wonderful grown children who seem relatively well adjusted. I think you can even ascertain, you know, even though I worked in the first year of their lives. I was incredibly lucky because Larry was a feminist when I met him, my husband. He had already read some in the area, and we really split everything pretty much 50-50, which is really helpful. Although I'm thinking of one time when our son, who was not a good sleeper, we were both looking down at him, and Larry said, "I think this is the first baby that's going to ruin 2 careers." But that's not what happened.
Of course not.
But one thing I do want to do, I don't want to make it sound like a walk in the park. I don't want to make it sound easy. To me, it was always really worth it because I really wanted my children and I loved them, but I also really loved my career. And by the way, the children are not there forever.
No.
And if you entirely derail your career for them, it may be hard to get back. But the thing that I want to contribute and say is, it's hard, but there's a lot of positive features to it. You know, there's alternative sources of gratification. And when something's going wrong in one area, it might go right in another area and help see you through. So when your 2-year-old is going through the terrible twos, maybe you'll get invited to a conference and be really excited about that, you know? Or when you get a rejection from a journal, which happens to all of us, you come home and you walk in the door and, "Mommy, Mommy," you know, they run up to you. So I think that has to be out there as well.
That's wonderful. That's really beautiful.